Our next speaker is Maddie Keating. And I should mention, y'all, if anybody in the back wants to come up front, there are some seats on the wings on both sides. Feel free to move on down if you'd like. Maddie is an environmental studies major with a minor in American Indian Studies, and she is graduating here in just a few days, June. Congratulations, Maddie. Maddie, and the reason I say that is Maddie actually fast-tracked her degree. She completed a degree in 3 years, so she wasn't near that long, but she didn't skimp on experiences. She was on the dean's list in every quarter that she was here at the University of Washington. She was also nominated for the prestigious Husky 100 Award. Yeah. Last summer, she spent time in Greece completing ethnographic interviews on perceptions of climate change, but her capstone today focuses on food. The title of her presentation is Exploring Personal Food Sovereignty, Proximity to Local Food's Impact on Relationships with Food. Her host organization was Whidbey Island Grown, where her site supervisor was Shannon Bly, and her faculty advisor was our very own Eli Wheat. Let's go ahead and give it up for Maddie. Yeah, I'll turn it up.
Can everybody hear me? Oh, perfect. Good now? Still can hear me? Okay. All right. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you think you know where your food comes from? Keep your hands up if you think 25% or more of it comes from local sources. 50%? As you can see, not many of us have access to a diet that is predominantly local foods. In fact, in King County alone, there are over 40 farmers markets, but they only account for 3% of the local food market. 3% is not very much. For my internship, I worked with Whidbey Island Grown, as Rex said, an organization that works to connect farmers and producers with consumers through an online ordering system, which is a great way to increase local food access on Whidbey Island. My internship raised a lot of questions for me. In particular, it raised the question, how does emotional and physical closeness to local food organizations, as well as the accessibility of local foods, influence an individual's personal food sovereignty, the ability to grow, produce, or gather their own food? To answer this question, I conducted a research study using 2 methods. The first was interviews with residents and farmers on Whidbey Island, and the second was a short online survey administered through social media and in person at farmers markets and other events. My research presented me with a wealth of information. In particular, it showed me individuals reported higher interest in purchasing local food when they also reported higher interest in increasing their own personal food sovereignty. As you can see in this graph, the higher amount of local foods they ate, shown on the x-axis, directly correlated with their interest in increasing their personal food sovereignty, the dark green. My research also identified 3 barriers that people most commonly reported as issues to increasing their food sovereignty. These were financial constraints, limited space and/or resources, and limited knowledge. The first barrier is something I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. Local food is hard to find, and it's even harder to buy, especially in urban areas. Local food can be really expensive and difficult to find, whereas on Whidbey Island, it's easier because there's a lot of farms there. The second barrier is something I'm sure we all recognize coming from Seattle, especially in urban areas. It can be really hard to find space to allow for gardening or local food production. For example, if you really were into canning, it's hard to do that in an apartment, or it's hard to have a garden in an apartment. The third barrier is limited knowledge, which is something that is an impact of an industrial agricultural system. There are minimal educational opportunities such as gardening workshops, cultural cooking classes, and more readily available to the public. In addition, farming is a really hard sector to get into, and residents of Whidbey Island often report that there's an unforeseen bias or prejudice towards amateur farmers. Despite this, as shown on this graph in the green, many individuals are interested in furthering their personal food sovereignty, and they want to participate in those educational workshops. So how do we solve this? There are a lot of solutions. Many of them are already being implemented today, especially on a personal scale. I'm sure you all are aware. But there are also community solutions and larger scale solutions. On a personal scale, individuals can work to identify where their food is coming from. They can advocate for more local food in their grocery stores or at restaurants that they frequent often. They can also eat seasonally, which means that they're more likely to be buying food that's closer to them. On a community scale, individuals can work, or communities can work, to implement more local food organizations, such as pea patches, food not bombs groups, or organizations like Whidbey Island Grown. We can also work to provide incentives for schools, restaurants, and businesses to prioritize using local food in their work. We can also work to allow for the use of EBT cards at farmers markets, which in my opinion is one of the most important things. On a broader scale, we need to work to decentralize the industrial agricultural system and prioritize and incentivize smaller scale farming. Smaller scale farms are much better at producing healthier, more nutritious, and vitamin-rich foods, and they're up to 3 times more productive than larger scale farms. The benefits of furthering personal food sovereignty would build a more nourished, connected, environmentally conscious world, but only if we do it right, which means we need to reach out to our more marginalized neighbors, especially unhoused BIPOC and female neighbors who have a lot of insight to bring to the table. And we also need to take a moment to reflect on what we want personally from our food systems. I would like to thank my friends and family, my Capstone cohort, especially my co-intern Rex, and my dog Ruka, who is in the corner over there. Can I answer any questions?
Wonderful presentation. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, like when you're talking about like bias towards more beginner farmers. I know that wasn't necessarily the focus of your project, but I'm just curious if you have any insights on ways that like farming can become more accessible to people that are interested in learning. That's kind of a big ask.
Right. So they were asking, I talked about bias and prejudice towards newer farmers in my presentation, and they were asking why that is and how we can change that, and how we can increase, younger farmers. Because I can tell you from my research that right now the demographic that is farmers right now is old, old. And that's not good. I mean, it's good because they're doing what they love, but it's not good that younger people aren't learning. So to answer your question, how I figured that out was, honestly, it was just things that people were reporting to me. So a lot of, in the interviews that I talked, when I talked to people, they were saying, oh yeah, well, there's this prejudice towards the younger farmers. People are like, oh, well, they're not learning properly. They don't know what they're doing, like blah, 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 which, they have to learn. So the thing that Whidbey Island is doing really well is they, one, they have an organization called the Organic Farm School, which works to teach younger generations and anyone who's interested really how to farm. I would say personally, another thing that needs to happen is to decrease the cost of starting up, which is also being done. There are, grants you can get, especially there are some producers who I connected with on Whidbey Island who got grants because they were Hispanic, and so they got grants for that to start their own business, and it's really flourishing now, and it's great to see. Any other questions? Yeah, over there.
I was curious as well as like if you're in an urban environment, obviously have constraints from like infrastructure standpoint, but you also like tend to have a constraint from a time perspective, like
yes,
gardening and growing your own stuff within an environment where you're in an urban area. It's also probably like difficult if you're working on like job that probably requires elsewhere.
Sorry, what was the question?
I'm just curious, like how much of that you saw in the survey, or how many people were commenting on that necessarily. I don't know, maybe up in the island.
So the question was, there is a lack of space in urban areas for farming, but there's also a lack of time. And the question was, did I see that in my responses and my interviews and my surveys? To answer your question, I mostly surveyed people on Whidbey Island, and Whidbey is known for its farming culture. And so a lot of people spend a lot of their time farming, and their profession is farming, so it's more complicated. But I'll say on a personal level, it's definitely something that I've noticed that, like, if that's not something that you're dedicating your life to, it's a lot harder, or if you're not passionate about it, it's a lot harder to start integrating that into your life, which is where community solutions come into play, because you don't have to necessarily have your own garden, but you could volunteer with a food bank, or you could volunteer with another gardening aspect, or even food production aspect.
Thank you very much.